Okay, the agenda has examined giving from a variety of angles: why we give, whom we help, how we go about doing that. We've asked what it means to be a charitable person in our rapidly changing world, and what it means to be truly grateful when someone gives us a hand. So tonight we're going to bring you the agenda's coverage of giving, and we begin with two programs that examine the nature of giving in the 21st century. How much do we help a cause when we travel, say, to Sierra Leone to help build a school or don a pink ribbon to support breast cancer research? Here's a look at how we help. Mary, you've got a book on this, Compassion, Inc., where you argue that corporate America is blurring a line between consumerism and charity. Lay out that thesis for us, if you would.
Well, what I looked at, what brought me to this idea was I saw Bono on Oprah Winfrey, actually, in 2006, and he was introducing Product Red, which was a campaign that took into account the Gap, and most people know it in terms of the Gap t-shirt that says inspired, and the RED is in the parentheses. But what happened with that campaign is they brought a number of different companies into the fold, such as Motorola and the Gap and Apple, and had them create red products, and then a certain percentage of the money would then go to the Global Fund. And when I originally saw that, I thought it was a great idea. People are already spending money. Why not take a certain percentage of that money and have it go to charity? Seemed like a great idea. But when I began to look at what's known as cause-related marketing, which is when a corporation uses a charity as a means to sell the product, I found that it wasn't quite as above board as it appears to be. In particular, what happens is that a charity may present a particular product and say, you go buy this bracelet and we'll donate up to $50,000 to Breast Cancer Research Foundation. Well, they'll tell you that they're donating the money, but they won't tell you when that $50,000 cap has been reached. So what I saw in my research was that more and more these kinds of charitable institutions were being used as a way to sell consumer products. Getting back to the point of what you were talking about around the table specifically is this idea of how are these charities being used for people, and how are they beginning to think about charity? And specifically what I mean about that is that charities became a means for consumers to justify buying very expensive consumer products. So I could feel good about buying a red Nano because I know $10 is going to the Global Fund. And I don't think that that's what charity should really be about.
Well, but if we can turn let's call it a self-centered act of shopping into something that benefits a charitable organization at the end of the day, how's that a bad thing?
Well, we don't know that the money is actually going to the charitable organizations. That's one thing. The other thing is that you may think that you're donating money, and you may in fact not be donating money. I'll give you an example from my own personal experience on that one. I needed dishwashing liquid, and I went to the store and I happened to see Dawn dishwashing liquid, which had a very big picture of a sea lion on the cover, and on the cover of the packaging, and it had a huge $1. And so I thought, okay, I need dishwashing liquid anyway. I'll pay for this, and $1 will go to help these poor sea lions. And it wasn't until I actually cleaned out the bottle that I saw in little teeny tiny type that I actually had to go online and input a code that was on the bottle to trigger that donation. So while I thought I was donating money, while I thought I was being a good charitable person, in fact I hadn't donated any money to the charity at all.
Interesting. And even, Dave, if it does go according to Hoyle, does it contradict the earlier religious principles we talked about namely, giving without an expectation of something in return?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the motivation for a lot of this, aside from the profit motive, obviously for profit companies, but there's also a sense in which we're trying to get every stakeholder, somebody you can have a contribution to make, to say, use the example of poverty, bring them all to the table and try to find out, is there something we could do in common that will make a difference? Which I think actually is a laudable thing. Because we have so much charity work, for example, there's no strategy to it. It's just one-off stuff. So this stakeholder idea, I think, is really powerful. But I think the downside, and I think Mara has said it well, is that, but we must be careful that we don't cheapen the whole idea. In other words, does the ends justify the means? And so I think for those of us especially, I think doing, say, I don't know, more longer-term traditional charity work, we don't want to give people the sense that somehow buying the right shampoo because it'll do this is somehow comparable, say in our case, making a commitment of over $500 a year to sponsor a child and to work with that child and in their community to make a difference and be there for 15 years.
Right.
I mean, you're not talking about the same thing here.
But do you feel that impression is being given right now in some
I think
respects?
sometimes that is, and yet, as I say, I'm reluctant to say it's all bad because I think there's some advantages to it.
According to StatsCan, a third of Canadians donate in response to canvassing at a shopping center or on the street. And I don't know how often you walk down the streets of Toronto, but there are, if you go up and down Yonge Street, you can get practically chased around the block by people who are representing very legitimate and wonderful causes, but who, you know, it looks like you're doing a 100-yard dash in some cases to try and get away from these folks if you don't have time to hear their pitch. What do we think of that in terms of trying to get people to be charitable under those circumstances?
Well, that obviously shows that there are needs out there to which we have not adequately responded, and obviously we need to give more as a total population. At the same time, when we're approached on the street like this, we wonder if this money is really going to the place where it is supposed to be going to. So one has to give in a situation in which one finds oneself, as much as the situation seems to demand. If we're giving to an organization that we know and we trust, obviously the bulk of our donations will go there. If we're giving to somebody on the street, it may be just a bare minimum to at least feel satisfied that we haven't said no to a good cause. We did what we can in that situation.
Mara, is it much more difficult to create a so-called culture of giving given the Great Recession that the world has gone through over the last 5 years?
Oh, gosh, yes. It becomes harder and harder when you think about, you know, everything costs a whole lot more money, and people are concerned about what their own particular situations are going to be. It becomes harder and harder to look beyond yourself. And I want to go back to a comment I made before about younger generation. I don't want to give the impression that I think that the younger generation is less caring. I think the younger generation is incredibly caring. I think the issue is that they have fewer and fewer outlets through which to express that caring because they haven't seen that pattern for them. There's a great article called Compassion Without Action, and it looks at these kinds of ideas about how people have the feelings of wanting to be compassionate, about how they want to do good things, but they're not really sure how to do that. Add to that the Great Recession and the inability to be able to have certainly the funds to be able to give to other people, and that becomes sort of a double whammy. On the other hand, though, going back to the idea of volunteerism has expanded significantly because people have a whole lot more time because a lot more people are unemployed.
There's a part of me that says, you know, people are just perhaps wanting to go out and help, which is the argument that Ben's making. So what's the problem if people just want to go out and help?
Well, there's an assumption that our being there does help. And I honestly think that if we want to contribute, there are other ways of contributing. There are organizations that do really solid long-term development work, and we could give that money that we're spending on our having this experience and give it to an organization that will do the work on the long term with the community on the ground and be there. What happens when you have a village or villages, and increasingly these are remote areas that are getting targeted for the short-term volunteerism because they're safer. The big cities tend not to be quite as safe in many of the developing countries, for want of another word, due to the impact of almost 30 years of structural adjustment and the transformation of economies. So you have extremes of wealth and the most people being very, very poor with a kind of an emerging middle class. So it makes it for city environments to be quite unsafe. And increasingly now you find organizations sending volunteers for short periods of time to small communities, remote communities. So people now have these foreigners in their lives all the time. My question is, why? Would we do that here? Would we welcome those people coming here? We have the world in Canada. Most of the volunteers in the study that Rebecca and I have been doing, and in my own personal experience after many years working with CUSO and doing work in this area, most of them do not have relationships with those communities in Canada. before or after. They're not interested in those cultures when they're here. They want to go there and have the encounter there. And to me, that reveals something that's quite problematic about what is behind this, because you were talking about motivation and wanting to help. We want to help, but who does that person have to be for us to want to help them?
I heard you say, Ben, murmur. You said we do that here. We do bring people
that.
over.
We bring people here all the time. And part of the beauty of the city and the country that we live in is that we're surrounded by people of all sorts of different cultures.
I think our point is we're not bringing them here for 2 weeks.
We're not bringing them. Some of them come here for 2 weeks, and that's fine with me. If they want to come here for 2 weeks, if they want to come here for a year, I think that our society benefits from having a multicultural outlook, and I think oftentimes, this is the same all around the world. And I think that, oftentimes, the host organizations that are on the ground in developing countries are the ones that are inviting people from Canada or elsewhere to come in and spend time with them. They're inviting them because you would think that they want them there. So obviously there is some need or some desire for Canadians over there.
What? They want them there. Okay, how is that want constructed? Like we did in the research that we did in 7 different countries. Peru, Guatemala, Jamaica, South Africa, Malawi, Zambia, and India. Or do organizations really want these people, or do they just feel they have to have them? It isn't clear to me that they necessarily want them, but this is how the aid package comes now. And if you have the foreigners, you get more money. If you don't have the foreigners, you have a problem because you don't have that kind of visibility. And there are ways in which having the foreigners also helps your work. I'm not saying it doesn't, but saying communities don't often feel they have a choice.
I think there often is this reverse ethnocentricity when we look at a community and they want us there, but we say actually, well, maybe they don't want us there. I think that we often have to listen to our local partners on the ground when they're asking for assistance. They know best what they want, what they don't want, better than we can. If we want to, we can depackage their asks and all the rest. But at the end of the day, I think that if they want us there, and there's a need, then we should be providing our services.
As part of TVO's Why Poverty campaign this past fall, the agenda looked at the divide between those who need public support and those who ought to be able to help themselves. Now, a look at public sentiment around helping the poor. The Salvation Army released a report about how Canadians regard the poor, and here's some of what they came up with. 43%, the survey said, 43% of Canadians agree that, quote, a good work ethic is all you need to escape poverty. 41% believe the poor would, quote unquote, take advantage of any assistance given to them and do nothing. 28% say the poor have lower moral values. And 23% in this Angus Reid survey done in March of 2011 say poor people are in that position because they are lazy.
In the words of Judge Judy, that's baloney. That's absolutely baloney.
And there's actually lots of psychological data and historical data sort of environmental studies that would absolutely say that it is baloney. Like those are fallacies. So for example, we had studies that just came out in February of this year that showed that very successful people are in fact less ethical than average citizens. And there's 35 years of data that shows that that's true. Why? Because people who are competing and succeeding, it's not necessarily that they're starting with bad genes, it's that they are exercising every day what psychologists call pro-self behavior. It's about me, it's about winning, gotta beat this guy, gotta beat that guy, gotta get to the top. You exercise those muscles for a long period of time, you're gonna have biceps and triceps like Popeye. But you're not asking the pro-social questions, the moral questions of the consequences of that competitiveness. So you end up with almost like olive oil legs. You don't have the strength to actually be able to navigate the ethical quandaries that are created by that competitive ethos. So those numbers are actually incorrect.
Vak, I wanted to ask you though, before you became poor, how did you regard poor people? Do you remember?
Well, there's two things in answer to that. One is that when I was growing up, and my father left my mother, my father who was in the Canadian Opera Company, and my father who sang on the stage at O'Keefe Centre, and my father who had guys like Robert Goulet and come over and babysit us and stuff like that. When he left, we were left in poverty, and I remember being different from the kids that I was going to school with, and I remember wondering why we weren't eating. I wondered why my mother was growing worse and worse in terms of how she looked at the world and how she was acting towards us. And when I pulled myself out of that and I got to this level, right? When I got to this level, I, being a good socialist, a good union man, right? I always believed that it was our responsibility, and I still believe it's our responsibility as a society to look after our fellow man and woman, that we can only be judged by how we look after people. So in answer to your question, how did I look at poor people? I always, looked with some sympathy, and I never ignored them, and I always talked to them, and I would never say to somebody on the street, get a job. Why don't you get a job, you bum, right? But until I actually came into this position and actually learned and tried to navigate through the system, when I was faced with the reality of not knowing where I was going to get my next meal, it's then and only then that I really began to understand what it really means to be poor in a society that has such wealth.
A key part of helping those in need is policy, recommendations aimed at lifting Canadians out of poverty. The agenda discussed the merits of a guaranteed annual income and the latest recommendations to improve social assistance here in Ontario. Here's a look. Andrew, guaranteed annual income, you like?
I like a lot of parts of it, a lot of aspects of it. So the basic idea of obviously of the state has an obligation to make sure nobody falls below a certain basic minimum, I like. And in fact, I would replace the current minimum wage with a minimum income guarantee. Secondly, I think the idea of trying to withdraw benefits very gradually as income rises is absolutely fundamental to any welfare reform. I mean, the person you quoted earlier who had written into the Globe and Mail, I would say to her is at the kinds of levels of income anybody's talking about with a guaranteed annual income, and at the kinds of effective tax rates that recipients are now facing with not only with withdrawal of cash support, but also withdrawal of certain benefits as their income rises. The real disincentive to work there is not giving money to people who don't work, it's taking it away from them when they do. And that's what you're really trying to correct. Giving people benefits in cash rather than in kind, I think, has a lot to recommend it. Give people the choices as to how they spend the money rather than only getting what the welfare bureaucracy tells them they have to have. And finally, delivering it through the tax system and moving it up to the federal level has a lot to recommend it, because you can have a much more integrated welfare to work type of system. The only point where I pause is, can you do the big bang that a lot of guaranteed annual income people are talking about, where you scrap a lot of other programs and replace it all with this one guarantee? Should you? Because some of those things, it's easy to say in the abstract, but when you look at specific programs, you might want to say, well, actually, that does address a certain need in a particular way that we don't want to get rid of. And if you don't scrap all those programs and you try to deliver a generous basic minimum and a very gradual withdrawal rate, you get into very high costs. So it's a hard nut to crack, is to balance all those different concerns so that you get a system that achieves all the things we're talking about, but doesn't do so at just enormous astronomical costs.
Lots of things to follow up on there, which we shall during the course of this. Armin, in one of your tweets, you apparently wrote, guaranteed annual income, an idea that never seems to go away, but never quite arrives. How come?
Well, we've been talking about some version of a guaranteed income to prevent people that don't have enough income from work or through famine since Speenhamland in England in the 1700s. And it's just one of these ideas that is very challenging. Everybody wants to do something to prevent people from just falling off the planet when things don't come together properly. And I can't say how much I appreciate the senator's championship of this issue. The fact that it is a conservative senator that is championing the need to do something about the growing inequality in this nation, and also the horrible treatment that people that are unable to work or unable to work enough to be able to make ends meet is it is very welcome to have somebody of your stature, sir, taking on this issue. I'm an economist, so I look at the costs. We know that we have had a number of models in place, and two of them appeared in '86 with the MacDonald Royal Commission, and then in 1993 by House. Each of them had very, very low rates of guaranteed incomes. And most recently, an economist colleague of mine, Rhys Kesselman from the Simon Fraser University, costed a guaranteed annual income at $11,000. which isn't a whole lot of money. It's less than $1,000
$11,000 per person.
for 3.5 million people in this country. So I don't know what figures you had in mind, but that model, that incredibly modest model, is completely unaffordable. It would require not only scrapping all the programs that we have in place, as Andrew mentioned, and some of those would mean that people that are receiving OAS and GIS would get $4,000 to $5,000 less than they currently get. But it would also mean raising taxes by 25 percentage points. And you can't raise taxes on the richest by another 25 percentage points, which means you're going to stick it to the middle class so that you can help the bottom.
Give me the whole nut on this, though. I mean, if it's $11,000 per person for the 3 million poorest Canadians,
no. It's a guaranteed income for everybody.
For everybody. So
but
what does that work?
Not everyone would need the full 11,000.
No.
So by the time you scale it back, I'm just telling you what the model is that
what's the
Professor
total
Kesselman
nut on that, then?
The way he calculated it was $380 billion, more than 20% of GDP. And then you start doing the scale back. So where, as Andrew pointed out, where you start clawing it back, at what rate you start clawing it back, you start getting into the technicality of something that becomes politically fraught. And I guess at the end of the day, the point is our money better spent, instead of giving it on income, making it easier for people to participate through childcare, through more affordable housing? If you don't do anything about the housing side of it, you give people more money, it just goes in one pocket and out the other pocket if you don't do rent control.
Okay, let me go to Ottawa. Glenn Hodgson, you're also an economist. Give us your take on the guaranteed annual income and how you see it.
Well, first of all, I'll join Armin in saying Senator Siegel's showing really important leadership on this file, has been for a long time. I wrote a kind of an innocent commentary about a year ago musing about this, and I think we should separate between the financial costs and the economic costs or benefits. I'm really interested in knocking the welfare wall down, getting rid of disincentives for people to get back in the workplace. Our starting point is that our growth potential for our economy is going to decline over the next 5 to 10 years. We're used to living in a world of 3.5% growth. We're now entering a world of growth of around 2%, but with a $14 billion fiscal deficit in a province like Ontario. So somehow we have to put our thinking caps on and come up with a lot more creative way of providing income support, encouraging people to re-enter the workforce, to try and revitalize the energy of our economy. And for me, frankly, all ideas should be on the table right now. I don't think we should use arithmetic on sort of one piece of analytics as a way to take the idea of a GI off the table. I think we really have to sort of roll up our sleeves and examine both the direct financial costs, but really the economic benefit of having higher labor force attachment, of getting rid of the welfare wall, of the savings we can reap in our healthcare system by having people more engaged in the workforce and the economy, are all things we have to examine, not just the arithmetic on the cost of the GI, but really the totality of impacts, both positive and negative, of being much more creative as we design social policy.
But tell me, have you done has the Conference Board done a cost-benefit analysis of this? And if they have, how did it come out?
Short answer is no, we have not, but we've done very detailed analysis on all the kind of little picky things that Armin mentioned that keep people out of the workforce. I think Andrew actually went at that in most detail. Everything from taking away benefits of people income rise, having marginal effective tax rates applied very early on. So we would love to do that as a major project, but of course it has to be scoped out properly and we have to be properly resourced to do something like that, Steve.
Remember this, and one of the reasons that there was a joint Ottawa-Manitoba pilot, if people are topped up above the poverty line, they're no longer eligible for welfare. Provinces have a huge burden in terms of the cost of welfare. They get a little bit of transfer from Ottawa as part of the social transfer, but it doesn't cover a large amount of it. Provinces would be liberated from that if the federal system taught people up through the tax system, which I think why it's attractive to Andrew. And then the provinces, of course, could use that money for other things. They could use it for early childhood education. They could use it for some other programs that Armin would think would be constructive and helpful. But now when you go to provinces and say, what about some new approaches to our social policy mix, some innovation, they say no money. We just tied up. We just don't have the capacity to do so. And I think when you look at the potential costs of this program as it ramped up, and if you look at some of the savings in other parts of our federal and provincial overheads that we sustain, I think you'd begin to see a balance achieved, except with much more freedom over time for low-income people to make their own choices. And I think that is where we want to be in terms of treating them as fellow citizens, not as clients and not as casework burdens.
Find that persuasive?
No. And the reason I don't
I wish you got off the fence and tell me how you really feel.
How I really feel is that we've got a federal government for whom talking about these sort of things creates an allergic reaction. They don't want to talk about raising the floor for the bottom, except for the Whitby, which was an important development, I think, for a handful of people. It's a very limited program. On the contrary, the federal government has been doing things to lower wages for the middle class. So actually, instead of bringing the floor up, it's actually been taking the middle and squishing it further down. And through the introduction of the temporary foreign workers, in addition to what's been happening with immigration, we've introduced more than 1 million people last year, and we have no national housing policy. Most of these people come into major urban centers where there's affordable housing crises. You really want to make people having more money and being less squeezed, we need to have the federal government supporting the provinces and the municipalities to be able to create more affordable housing options. You fix the housing problem, you fix a great deal of the poverty problem, and certainly the hunger problem across the country.
I'm going to share with our audience the grim numbers that you are dealing with. Let's start with Ontario Works. Ontario Works is the main social assistance program in the province, and there are almost 500,000 people who are caught up in this program of Ontario Works. Almost half of them live in the Greater Toronto Area. 60% of them are singles, 30% are single parents with children, 14% are newcomers. 33% have completed high school, but 24% have post-secondary education. How about the Ontario Disability Supports Program? That's another one. Again, more than 400,000 people on that. 43% have a physical disability, 39% a mental disability, and that is the fastest growing cohort. 18% have a developmental disability. A little over a third live in the Greater Toronto Area. 77% are singles, 9% single parents, 30% have completed high school, and 19% have post-secondary education. And one more. Here's the spending on social assistance. A combined provincial municipal spending clocks in at $8.3 billion in the year 2011-12, provincial spending at $7.5 billion, provincial spending on employment services at $214 million, and those are the grim details that you have been dealing with in your deliberations. Munir Sheikh, get us started on this. What did you determine, generally speaking, about the way we do things now that doesn't work?
Well, I wish I could say that there's something in the program that works. We think the program just doesn't work at all. There are two objectives the program should try to achieve. The first is to help people get back to work. It doesn't do that very well. The second is to provide reasonable levels of income support to people during the time they're not working. And the system is such that the benefit rates are all over the map, but in general, it is hard for anybody to say that the system is meeting that objective either.
Do you agree with that? You've looked at this system and nothing about it works?
Very little. I think the thing that was the most stunning for us is that if there's a part that works, it's actually the general welfare part that everybody actually thinks has a lot of cheats and welfare bums and people who just don't want to work, and that's not what we found. 75% of people who come into Social Assistance Ontario Works leave within the first year. Now 50% of them end up coming back, but that says a lot about the job market out there and people cycling through, and with low asset limits and other things, they're cycling down into poverty with less financial resiliency and less likely to be able to make it out of that trap. But what was really stunning is the growth in people with disabilities who are living on social assistance. It's the fastest growing category. It's persistent at 5% growth a year. That doesn't line up with any other natural demographic out there. And underlying that is a very disturbing trend that 60% of the new entrants are people who have mental illness challenges, and we don't know a lot about how to deal with workplace accommodation, and yet leading research says employment and treatment together is the most effective way to help people with mental illness regain their entry into life.
But of course, in the Great Recession, these are the least likely people who are going to be hired. Is that fair to say?
Probably, but the focus of our recommendation really is the long term. The impact of the recession is quite short term. In fact, people are talking about labor shortages over the longer term. And when we looked at the program, we came to the conclusion it truly will be a shame when there's a shortage of workers in Ontario and in Canada over the longer term that these people actually are not able to find jobs. So it truly is our perspective over the longer term which told us that employment should be the focus.
Okay, after almost 2 years of looking at this, you've come out with a whole bunch of recommendations. We're going to highlight some of them right now, and then we'll talk about why you've recommended what you've recommended. So here we go. Brighter prospects, the highlights from the Commission for the Review of Social Assistance in Ontario. Number 1, merge Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Program into a single social assistance system delivered not at the provincial level, but at the municipal level. Continuing, simplify the benefit structure and create a standard rate. Do not introduce new benefits within the social assistance program without making those same benefits available to all low-income Ontarians. Remove disability and children's and health benefits from social assistance and make them available to all low-income Ontarians. Develop a new basic measure of what constitutes an adequate stipend to live off. Only ask recipients to report when there is a change in income and provide the option to report changes online, and appoint a provincial commissioner of social assistance. Okay, lots to unpack here, so let's get to this. Francis, the most significant recommendation, I guess, you want to merge OW and ODSP into one program and have it delivered municipally.
Right.
Why?
First of all, the two programs are built on the premise that one is for people who can work and the other is for people who have disabilities, which, underneath that suggests those people can't work. That's just not true. There are a lot of people with disabilities that we met who aspire to work. We need the right kind of supports. We may need more intensive supports. Multi-barriered individuals will need a different and personalized set of supports than someone who perhaps is more job ready. And
are we capable of doing that?
We are. We're capable of segmenting the population, the needs, and matching the resources to that if we have it all in one place. Right now, for a lot of people on ODSP, if they try to find support for employment services, they have to go to a municipality anyways. The second reason for it to be at the municipal level is that's where local communities know local employers. Yes, there are large employers that are national or provincial that will hire and we will work with them. But at the local level, where most of the jobs are, it's small employers. You need to know them. You need to be in touch with the economic development departments in municipality to know what companies are coming in. How can we train individuals that are here in this pool of aspiring workers for the jobs that employers coming are going to need?
And I guess they do childcare and housing as well at a local level.
Very important point, Steve, because a lot of people when they're in this situation, the first step towards a job is actually to stabilize their lives. And it may be that they need housing. It may be that they need childcare. They may need treatment or addiction services. Those are all at the municipal level. And we foresee a time where those are integrated, where they're not different pockets, different silos, where they're integrated supports wrapped around the individual based on the plan that they build together with their caseworker of the pathway to employment.
When someone helps, gives, or demonstrates an act of kindness, to whom should we be grateful? Last Thanksgiving, we asked that question. We will discuss the big question of the evening, which is, does being grateful presume that there is a someone to whom we should be grateful for all of the wonderful things that we see around us? And here is what, Imam, you're not going to like this, but what the heck. Here's Richard Dawkins, one of the world's most famous atheists, who says on the subject, when I lie on my back and look up at the Milky Way on a clear night, and see the vast distances of space and reflect that these are also vast differences of time as well. When I look at the Grand Canyon and see the strata going down, down, down through periods of time which the human mind can't comprehend, it's a feeling of sort of an abstract gratitude that I am alive to appreciate these wonders. When I look down a microscope, it's the same feeling. I am grateful to be alive to appreciate these wonders. Okay, let's get into this. Nada, you first, and then we'll go over to the Imam after that. Is it possible to be grateful without there being anybody, namely God, to be grateful to?
I think gratitude, one is always grateful to someone for something. So it presumes what Martin Buber would call an I-thou relationship. If you're grateful, you're in an I-thou relationship as he is with the universe, say the natural world. And that's different from an I-it relationship, where I use something and I control it and it serves me. I'm not grateful to the glass for containing water. I may be grateful that the glass has water, that someone has given me water. So when we're talking about, I can be grateful to you for something you've done or how you've been to me, who is he grateful to? Well, he's grateful to the mystery. And religious people say that when they're grateful for life, they're not grateful, they are grateful to their parents, but their parents aren't the creators of life. So life is a bigger thing. And you're talking with a mystery. You're having an I-thou relationship with a thou that you can't know, define, understand, and certainly not control in the way that you can experience another human being. So I don't think when we get into that level, I know certain people have written to say Dawkins has no right to be grateful because he has no God.
He doesn't believe.
He doesn't believe, but he doesn't have a named God. He resents the definitions, and he gets, very excitable about how other people have defined. And I agree with some of his objections for sure, but that doesn't matter. He's in an I-thou relationship. He's in you have to be in an attitude of humility. When we were talking about, is it right to say I'm grateful that I'm not you? Well, that's arrogant. I'm judging your life, and the cause of unhappiness and the antonym of gratitude and humility is not poverty or deprivation or which of us is better off. It's that judgment.
Lack
I
of
judge.
respect.
Yeah, it's a lack of respect, and it's a presuming that you can judge the value, the ultimate value of external things.
Okay, Shabir Ali, will you weigh in on that?
Well,
are you a man of religion, Shabir? I think you are.
Yes, and actually I love the quotation because though coming from an atheist, it actually points to our need to appreciate the great things in life, which we know could not have come here by just mere chance. When we speak of gratitude as he speaks, then we often think of someone deliberately or intentionally giving us the thing for which we are grateful. And if somebody has so much money that he's walking along the street and $100 bills are falling out from his pockets as he walks, and we pick up those $100 bills, we don't rush after him to thank him, sir, thank you very much for this $100 bill, because he didn't intend to give it to us. He just has so much, he's just going about. When we see the Grand Canyon or whatever it is that is so breathtaking and beautiful, we have to really reflect on who has really created all of this to give us that sense of beauty, to cater for our aesthetic needs as well. Brandon Carter in 1974 proposed the anthropic principle, which basically holds that right from the inception, the universe was programmed to create sentient beings like ourselves who would appreciate the beauty of the universe. The Quran speaks about the beauty in things as one of the gifts of God as well, and for which we need to be thankful.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.